So it's been a couple of months since we got back from our trip to Namibia, and I posted a few videos on the channel, and I've had quite a few questions off the back of them, primarily from people that are looking to plan a trip to Namibia. So what I thought to do is a separate video which kind of goes into a little bit more detail on how I plan the trip and some things that we learnt along the way to help you get the most out of your trip. So Namibia is somewhere that I've wanted to visit for a very long time. I've seen so many amazing images, primarily of Sossusvlei and Deadvlei. That's what first inspired me to visit Namibia. But after researching the country and building an itinerary, I really discovered so many amazing places to visit. For me, Namibia is all about the vast wilderness and untouched beauty, and it seems like a lot of other people are coming to that conclusion. Tourism in Namibia does seem to be on the up. So let's get started with some more basic information about our trip. I went with my partner Rebecca in late August, early September. And one of the main reasons for doing that is it's a really good time for safari in Etosha National Park. It's right at the end of the dry season, so a lot of the animals will gather around the waterholes dotted around the park, and it makes it really easy to see the animals. That being said, it does get quite chilly at night and in the mornings, but during the day it's a really nice temperature, and we had clear blue skies for 2 weeks. To be honest, from the research I did, there doesn't seem to be a bad time to visit Namibia. It just sort of depends on what you want to do when you're there. So for us, safari was something that was important to us, so we planned our trip around that best time of year. And we knew during the day it wouldn't get too hot for doing hikes and various activities. So moving on to transport and getting around Namibia, and you're pretty much going to be limited to either doing a self-drive or by joining a group tour. So in our case, we did a self-drive and we hired a 4x4 Toyota Hilux, which was brilliant. They are very well suited to the country of Namibia, very well built, very reliable. A 4x4 vehicle isn't necessary, but there were a few things on our trip where we did need one, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the video. And one of the things we really wanted to do in Namibia was the whole rooftop camping experience, which is really popular in Southern Africa and is a great way to see Namibia. So in the capital of Windhoek, there are loads of companies where you can rent your vehicle and also all of the camping equipment that you'll need in one package, as well as the rooftop tent fitted to your vehicle. We had plates, cutlery, glasses, a gas canister and stove, a fridge freezer, camping chairs, basically everything you'll need for a camping experience. And when I was finding a company that could provide all of this equipment, I did find it a bit overwhelming just how many companies there are in the capital of Windhoek. So to help narrow down my focus, I looked at some Google reviews, and I wanted a company that had good communication and had a track record of responding well to an issue if it did come up. It does seem like across the board, all the companies have the same sort of equipment list and have the similar vehicles. So that's where I focused. I focused more on the customer service side of things. And one thing I'll mention here is to book well in advance, because particularly during the peak times in the year, cars and camping equipment does get booked up, so just something to bear in mind. So that leads me on to what it's like driving in Namibia and some general safety things to consider. Now, I think for a lot of other locations, I probably wouldn't spend too much time on this, but Namibia does present some unique things to consider. And when I say safety, I don't mean in terms of crime or anything like that. It's more to do with the fact that Namibia is very sparsely populated. It's very remote, and at times we went 2 hours of driving without seeing another car. So when we arrived at the airport, we did pick up a local SIM card, and we did have good signal for most of the trip, I would say, but I wouldn't solely rely on it. One thing I did buy, and it's been on my list to buy for quite a few years, is a satellite communication device. So this is the Garmin InReach Messenger. There are lots of other brands you can buy, but essentially this gave us the ability to message people even if we didn't have signal. It's one of those things that you hope to never use, but it's good to know that if we did have a serious issue, we could get into contact with someone. And if you don't want to purchase one, they are quite expensive. Quite often you can hire one from your car rental company. But like I say, we had signal with our SIM card for most of the trip, and we mainly stuck to the main roads. I think if you're looking to go a little bit off the beaten track, I would definitely look into getting some sort of satellite device. Another thing to expect is driving on gravel roads. Now, as someone that lives in the UK, we don't have gravel roads. Everywhere is tarmac, so we're not very familiar with this sort of driving. But we started off the trip quite slow and then built up our confidence over time. And then towards the end of the trip, it was pretty much second nature, to be honest. We got quite used to it. It just takes a little bit of time to get a feel for how the car behaves. What I would say is to make sure that your tyres are at the correct pressure, and that generally helps with stability of the car. And the last thing that I'll say in this section is to make sure that you're comfortable with changing a tyre on the vehicle in case of a flat tyre. Of course, with driving on gravel roads, there is an increased risk of punctures. So just make sure that you've got everything that you need before you start your trip. And pretty much all the hire car companies will show you exactly what you need to do in case of a flat tyre. That being said, driving in Namibia is a great experience and certainly adds to the sense of adventure. So I thought it'd be worth having a separate section which talked about route planning and how you can sort of get started with that. So I used a combination of Google Maps and a website called Tracks for Africa. And I think Google Maps is a good place to start in terms of mapping out some locations you might want to go to, quickly seeing some images, quickly seeing some reviews, and just sort of getting a rough idea of where you might like to go. But what Google Maps is not great at is giving you an idea of the journey times, particularly on gravel roads. I think I'm right in saying that Google Maps calculates the journey time based around what the speed limit is. And of course, if you're driving on gravel roads, you're not always able to go at that speed. So in our experience, we sort of took the Google Maps time and then added on 20%. So that's why I use sort of Tracks for Africa, which gives a much more accurate representation of what the journey time will take, has much more information on the condition of the road, whether it's gravel, whether it's tarmac, whether it's sand even. So Tracks for Africa is a really good resource to use in addition to Google Maps. Namibia is a massive country, and when I was planning the trip, I was quite conscious to make sure that we weren't always driving, we weren't always in the car, and we did have enough time to explore outside of the car. I also spaced our longer travel days quite evenly throughout the 2 weeks, so we didn't have 2 days in a row where we were sort of driving for 5 or 6 hours. And then the final thing I'd say in this section is to just sort of think about where certain supermarkets are and fuel stations, just sort of making sure they're along the route. I think if you're sticking to the main tourist areas, this won't really be an issue. But if you're looking to go a little bit off the beaten track, that's maybe something to have a think about. So let's talk a little bit more about the actual itinerary and the various places that we visited over 14 days. So of course, starting in the capital of Windhoek, we then went south to a place near the town of Keetmanshoop. Now this area is a really great place to go to see the Quiver tree, which is not actually a tree, but a type of aloe, but they are incredibly unique and a great subject for photography. So we had 2 nights in this area, split across 2 different campsites. The first one was called the Quiver Tree Forest Rest Camp, which is fairly popular, and the second campsite was called the Mesosaurus Fossil Campsite. If I had to choose between the 2 campsites and if I had 1 night, I would definitely go to the Mesosaurus Fossil Campsite. as I found that the facilities were a little bit better and I kind of felt like there was so much more area to explore. The next place on our trip was the Fish River Canyon, and it was about a 2-hour drive from the Mesosaurus fossil campsite. And Fish River Canyon is the second largest canyon in the world and the largest in Africa. And to be honest, I think the videos and photos that I took doesn't really do it justice. It is a huge canyon and I think definitely worth visiting on your trip. We stayed relatively nearby to the canyon at the Canyon Roadhouse, which was fantastic. The campsite facilities were brilliant. It had a really nice pool, and I think just the overall setting was really nice. We only stayed one night here, and I think that's probably enough to do Fish River Canyon, unless you want to do a little bit more adventurous hiking. So next on our list was going to a campsite right on the edge of the NamibRand Nature Reserve, and this area is really beautiful, and I'd say it's fairly well known for having a lot of luxurious and very expensive lodges. But fortunately I did find one campsite, as I say, right on the edge of the nature reserve, and it was run by a lovely couple that have a farm there, and they'd converted some of the land for camping. What I would say is it definitely paid off to do a little bit more research and find some lesser known locations in this area. This is just one example, but I'm sure there are lots of other really amazing campsites. I actually found this campsite on Tracks for Africa, and you won't necessarily find this on your usual booking sites like booking.com, so it's another reason to use Tracks for Africa. So next on our trip was a short drive to the area of Sossusvlei, and like I mentioned at the start of the video, this is probably the area that inspired me to visit Namibia, and I would say it's probably the most popular place to visit in Namibia. This really is a spectacular location and is home to some of the tallest dunes in the world. And we stayed for a total of 3 nights in this area, which I would say was a good amount of time and a good split between relaxing by the pool, but then also doing various activities, doing some hikes and things like that. So I found it was a good point in the trip to do that. We actually stayed at 2 different locations. We stayed at the Sossusvlei Lodge and the Cesarium campsite. And I'm going to talk a little bit later in the video on why we picked those locations, because there are some extra things to consider for this area. So one thing that you're going to want to see in the Sossusvlei area is Deadvlei. And this is the petrified trees in the clay pan. And there's one thing that you need to know about visiting Deadvlei, and that's that the last bit of the journey involves a sand track. I think it's about 4 kilometers, but you will definitely need a 4x4 vehicle for that. If you don't, or if you don't want to do the trail yourself, there is the option of a shuttle service where essentially you park your car, hop on the shuttle, and then they'll take you to the start of the Deadvlei trail. But I wanted to do the sand track for 2 reasons. The first one being, I think it'd be a great experience and would add to the adventure. And I'd sort of done enough research to know what I needed to do to avoid getting stuck. The second reason is I wanted to go to Deadvlei at sunrise and sunset, and the shuttle service isn't really available at these times. I think there is a service at sunrise, but it wouldn't get me there in time for the photos that I was looking to capture. And it all worked out in the end. We didn't get stuck. From what I read, it's all about momentum. You just don't stop, you know, you keep going. As soon as you stop, the car sort of sinks into the sand. And then another tip I read is to let a bit of pressure out of the tires. That helps with the traction. And then it sounds obvious, but remember to engage 4x4 mode. But all in all, it was a brilliant experience. And if you do get stuck, there are people on hand to help you get out. So yeah, you don't have to worry too much. So next on our list was the area of Spitzkoppe. And essentially this is a grouping of huge granite rocks which are very, very impressive. This area is known as the Matterhorn of Namibia, and it's clear to see why. this is another must-visit location. So we stayed at the Spitzkoppe Community Rest Camp, which is a fairly basic setup, to be honest. Each camping area has a basic toilet, a place where you can have a braai, and a sort of seated area for dinner. And in the main sort of reception area, there are showers and a general sort of washing up facility. But what you're really here for is the spectacular landscape. One tip for staying at this camp location is to arrive and check in quite early in the day, because camping spots are assigned on a first come first served basis, and some spots are better than others. What you don't want to do is get there late in the day and then have to spend quite a lot of time driving around the various camping spots trying to find a free one. So yeah, that's my tip there. And then we stayed here for 2 nights, which I think was a good amount of time. So one thing that was a change of plan on our trip was the Sandwich Harbour tour. And essentially this is a trip out to some very remote dunes that go right up to the sea. And originally we didn't have this in our plan because I sort of read that it's very cold, very misty, very foggy on that coastline, and the experience isn't as good when it's like that. But when we got to Spitzkoppe, we had a look at the weather forecast for the next day, and it looked quite clear and sunny. So we messaged a few companies to see about doing a tour, and fortunately we did find one. So the plan was to, in the morning, drive back to Swakopmund, do the tour, and then drive back to Spitzkoppe before sunset, which we did. And I'm glad that we did the tour in the end, because it was a really good experience and definitely one to remember. So the last area that I'm going to talk about in this video is Etosha National Park. Now, I said at the start of the video that this is somewhere that we really wanted to go, and it's known as somewhere where you can do a self-drive safari. So in total, we spent about 2.5 days on safari, which I felt like was a good amount of time. I think towards the end, we definitely felt like we'd seen most of what we wanted to. And we stayed at a few different places in this time. So after a long drive from Spitzkoppe to get to where Etosha National Park is, we stayed at the Ongumu Tambuti campsite, which was really good. It's actually located not too far away from the entrance, so the plan would be to just stay there for the night and then the next morning get up early and head into the park. And then for the next 2 nights we would stay inside the national park. So the first night was at the Quiver campsite, and the second night was at Halali. Both campsites have a water hole which you can just walk from your camp to and see animals at night. And we were really lucky with lots of activity. They use a special light so the animals aren't distracted. What I would say about the campsites inside the national park is they're not brilliant, to be honest. I would say the facilities are a little bit dated. They definitely need a bit of modernisation, but our sort of justification was that we're not really there for the camping experience. We're there to see the animals and have access to the water holes at night. So for us it was a small price to pay, but if you want a little bit more for your money, definitely consider staying outside of the park and then sort of travelling in each day. So I thought it'd be useful to give you an idea of costs and what to budget for a trip like this. I suppose I'll caveat all of this by saying that these are rough estimates, and obviously a lot depends on the current exchange rate. So the first big cost is our car and all of the camping equipment. So this came to £1,560 for 14 days. And this was during peak season as well. It can be cheaper at other times in the year. And then of course, you're going to be traveling a lot, you're going to be driving a lot, so fuel does add up. And I think we spent about £400 in fuel. I think the trip was about 3,500 kilometers in the end. So we mainly cooked ourselves at the campsites. So we stocked up at supermarkets. And I think over 2 weeks, we probably spent about £300. And when it comes to the national parks, so for 2.5 days in Sossusvlei, it cost us £45 for both of us. And then 2.5 days in Etosha cost the same, £45 for both of us. In terms of restaurants and eating out, we did occasionally eat out. I can't give an estimate on what it cost us as a whole, but what I would say is it is pretty good value. So just to give you an idea, a main meal and a drink, we were probably spending about £10 each. In terms of the campsites, I won't list them out individually, but it ranged anywhere from £15 to £45 per night. Places like Sossusvlei and Etosha National Park were more expensive, so that sort of £45 end. In terms of cash versus cards, we took a small amount of cash just in case, probably enough to fill up the car with fuel, just if there was a problem with the machine or something. But to be honest, in most places we were able to use our card. That being said, I would bring a small amount of cash anyway, because you'll need it for tips, particularly at restaurants and at the petrol stations. And then just a final word on cash. So you can't get the Namibian dollar outside of Namibia, you can only get it when you're there. But the South African rand effectively mirrors the Namibian dollar, and the two currencies are used interchangeably only in Namibia. For us in the UK, we can get South African rand, we can't get obviously Namibian dollar, so we just exchanged South African rand and then took it over with us. Of course, if you do have any cash left over and you plan to exchange it in your home country, obviously make sure it's South African rand and you get rid of all your Namibian dollars. So as a travel and landscape photographer, I thought it was worth having a separate section which talked about some more specific tips and tricks for photographers. So first of all, in Sossusvlei, there is one thing that you need to be aware of. It's that there are two gates at the entrance. There's an outer gate and then there's an inner gate. The outer gate opens at sunrise and then closes at sunset, and then the inner gate opens 1 hour before sunrise and closes 1 hour after sunset. And with the main sort of photography locations being about an hour drive into the park, if you're staying at an accommodation or a campsite outside of the outer gate, then you're not really going to be able to take advantage of the, nice soft golden light. So really, to make the most of the good light, you need to find some accommodation or a campsite between the outer gate and the inner gate. And there are a few to choose from, but they do book up quite far in advance. So there is one more option, which is to stay inside the inner gate. We stayed at the Sossusvlei Lodge, which is exactly that. It's inside the inner gate, and it effectively means that you can bypass those closing and opening times of the gates. It doesn't mean that you can be in the park all night and be out all night exploring. That's still not allowed, but it does give you a little bit more time to explore at sunrise and sunset. And it did allow us to do something that I really wanted to do, which is to visit Deadvlei at sunset. Now, a lot of people visit for sunrise, but from the research I did and the images that I wanted to capture, it seemed like sunset was the better option. Now, once you take into account the walk to Deadvlei from the 4x4 parking area and the sand track and the drive back to the gate, I don't think it's really possible to be at Deadvlei for sunset and then get back in time before the gate closes. You're going to have to leave quite early and you're not going to make the most of the light. Whereas staying at the Sossusvlei Lodge kind of allows you a little bit more time to spend at Deadvlei, and that's exactly what we did. And I captured some images I really loved. So staying at Sossusvlei Lodge is going to cost you, I think it cost us about £450. So it is expensive, but for me, it was totally worth it. Another photography tip is, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but it's to stay inside the park at Etosha. This will give you really good access to, photographing some animals at the waterhole during sunrise, sunset and overnight. And I'm sure you can do it outside of the park at some private game reserves, but if you're looking to go to Etosha, I'd definitely recommend to stay at the campsites inside the park. And then just a word on some gear. So I hired a teleconverter specifically for this trip. So if you're not aware what a teleconverter does, it effectively increases the zoom, the range of your lens. So I took a 100 to 400 millimeter lens, which gives you quite a lot of reach, but for safari in particular, I didn't think it gave me enough. So to be on the safe side, I hired a 1.4 times teleconverter, which effectively turns the 100 to 400 millimeter lens into a 140 to 560 millimeter lens. So it kind of gave me that little bit more reach and allowed me to get some more intimate shots of some animals. And the reason I hired it as opposed to buying it is, firstly, they are quite expensive, and secondly, I just wouldn't really use it that much. So it was quite affordable to rent, but definitely recommend looking into doing that. And then just a final mention on the use of drones in Namibia. So there is an official permit that you need to get from the government, which I don't think a lot of people are aware of. I sort of read of reports of drones being confiscated at the airport, so I made sure to do the official process. And it is quite a lengthy process. It takes a little bit of time to fill out all the forms, and they advise to get your permit application in about 60 days before your trip. So you have to mark out all the different locations you intend to fly the drone. So it is quite strict as well. The reason why I wanted to take the drone was just for video purposes really, as opposed to the photography. So yeah, hopefully those few tips help you out for a photography trip. So for the final section of this video, I just wanted to provide some useful things that we packed in addition to the usual things you would pack for a trip like this. So the first one is we took a thermos flask, which we sort of used it for coffee in the morning. So obviously at a campsite you have to boil the kettle on the stove, and in the mornings that's not really the thing you want to be doing. So what we did was boil the water the night before, make the coffee in the flask, and then by the time we woke up the next morning it was sort of warm enough. And quite often we had to be on the road early, or we were out exploring at sunrise, so that was a real time saver. We also took a couple of head torches, which were really useful around the campsites at night. We took our own sleeping bags. Now, the company that we were hiring from, they provided some sleeping bags, but from the reviews I read beforehand, a lot of people were saying that they weren't very good or they weren't very warm. So we took our own sleeping bag in our luggage. We made sure it was like really thick, nice and warm. Plus, I think it's a bit nicer to have your own sleeping bag as well. So that was a really good thing that we packed. And then the final thing is not necessarily something that we packed, but before the trip, we did make a list of, some campsite meals that we could make. We're not overly experienced with camping and cooking at a campsite, so we just came up with a list of simple meals that we could make throughout the whole trip. And it also meant that when we got to a supermarket, we knew exactly what we needed to get for the next leg of the trip before we got to the next supermarket, if that makes sense. So I'd rather think about those sort of things before the actual trip. So that wraps up this video. I hope you found it useful. And I've got to say, we had a brilliant time in Namibia, and I highly recommend it to anyone that's looking for a more adventurous holiday. If you do have a question on something I didn't cover in this video, please feel free to comment down below. But otherwise, thanks so much for watching, and hopefully see you in the next video.